Good
Um,
evening, everybody, and welcome to the Leather Chronicles episode 6. This one's going to be fun. It's an origin story prequel, if you will. We've all heard Mama Vi's stories over the years. This one is apparently one not many of us have heard. I believe the story is how Mama got to be the way she is, and it's an origin story. So, Mama, take it away.
First of all of you can start by blaming Courtney for this. About a month ago, we were sitting in the library, and as one of the newest docents and worker bees for the library, I was trying very hard to explain to her not just what the library meant to me, but what the library means to this community and our future. And the fact that she was pretty much taking on the equivalent of a sacred charge. Was it more blood, sweat, and tears than she would ever expect? Yes. Did I believe it was rewarding? Yes. Um, and then she asked essentially how in the world I became this passionate. And in telling her that was a long story that she may not have time to hear, she sat down, kind of perched her head up like this and went, "I'm all ears." So you can blame Courtney for at least the next 45 minutes to an hour. How the heck did I get to be who, how, and where? Um, I was born in 1952. I am 71 years old. I was born in New York, but spent my entire early years in a little town in New Jersey, about 25 minutes as the crow flies from Midtown Manhattan. I grew up in a little town called Roselle. It was a town where both good news and bad news could get home before you did. But it was also the kind of town where if you knocked on any door, at least when I was a child, that door would always open. More often than not, the door was open anyway. So all you really had to do was knock and go in. Now, I need you to imagine all of the classic jokes about being on the wrong side of town. To some extent, my family was, in that the town that I lived in had an interesting history. In the 1800s, it was originally a gated community and a millionaire's paradise. The workers, who were predominantly Black at that time, families lived on one side of town, and there weren't that many of them. It was decided by about 1915 there were enough families that the town needed a church, which the First Baptist Church was happy to spin off. And the Black families of that town all went pretty much to the same church. Now, to tell you a little more about Roselle, Thomas Edison had his first village plant there. The first chandelier ever lit by electric bulbs was lit in Roselle, and so on and so forth. In the little 2.5 block area where I lived, there were 14 Black families in an otherwise pretty much all white town, at least on the end where I was. There were a few more Black families on the border at the other side of town, but even then, not many. Now, I grew up in a very big house. There were 3 and often 4 generations all under the same roof. Not uncommon. And when I say big, I mean 24 rooms. My grandparents, my mother's parents, specifically, since I was raised by my mother, a single mother, was the oldest of 7 children. 6 of them lived in the same house. One uncle was rebellious and decided that he was going to separate himself from his family and moved 8 blocks down. The youngest brother didn't want to separate and built the house across the street. So having relatives running around that I could just cross the street and see was common. But now my mother was the oldest of 7, but my mother's mother, who with her husband were the matriarchs of the family, unless her mother, my great-grandmother, came to visit. She was the second of 12, with all of her siblings alive and quite often dropping in. The family was from central Jersey, about 60 miles away, and founded a town there. The church and the main road are still there. So history was something that was always around me. It wasn't something I studied, it was something I lived. Part of the family was very active in the Prince Hall Masons, and I heard the stories of Prince Hall. My mother's mother, the woman I'm named after, was the daughter of a Methodist minister whose grandfather rode with Wesley, as in the Wesley Methodists. So I lived in history. I never thought anything about it. They were the stories that I heard at the feet of many generations who were also always around me. Now, as the only child growing up in the house, it was a kind of interesting place to be. Not just because of the family's history, but because of the family's religious beliefs. Now, follow the bouncing ball here. Thinking on my mother's side, her mother was the daughter of a Methodist minister. She scandalized the family by marrying a Baptist boy, whose older brother was a rabbi. Now, my mother, for grins, giggles, and possibly rebellion, became Anglican. Why don't you guess what my weekends were like? But my mother was also a member of the Beat, as in beatnik generation. I was a change of life baby. She had me at 40 and lived a pretty wild life from the few family stories that anyone was willing to tell before she had me. So, okay, on any given Sunday, in the house could be my grandmother's siblings, possibly my grandfather's siblings, a couple of ministers, a rabbi or two, a few priests, and just for grins, throw in a few pagans, a practicing witch, and a vampire. It made my life kind of interesting. But on Saturdays, in the house could be Black directors, remembering that at the time, very rarely were colored films shown in white theaters. So directors like Michelou and the other Black filmmakers who traveled what then was called the Chitlin Circuit gathered in family homes that were large enough to accommodate 40 or 50 chairs. And the movies were shown in private houses to the Black community. My house was one of those. They would always shoo the kid off to bed, not realizing the kid had come down the stairs much earlier and was hiding under the piano so that I could watch or hear this. And I learned even more history. Ultimately, before they thought they had chased me up to bed, I got to meet living history, not realizing the importance of the people who were aunts and uncles. And in Black families, that's quite common. It's Auntie so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so, or Mr. so-and-so and Ms. so-and-so. You didn't figure out until you were much, much older that they really weren't related by blood, but it actually really didn't matter. So an auntie who stopped in the house on occasion when I was young was a woman named Katerina Jabora. She was an opera singer who, like many Black opera singers, wasn't allowed to sing in the United States and made her debut in Paris. She told me stories of her lover, a guy named Derek. Now, what I didn't realize was that she was spinning wonderful tales of the Paris Opera House for a child, because that was where she sang, in Paris. Now, when I got to be much older, a friend of Mistress Mears sent me to Paris specifically to spend 4 hours in that opera house alone. But I digress. That's another story. I didn't realize that one of the great Black pianists, who I saw usually once a month, was famous. He was just there. I didn't realize that a lot of my mom's hippie friends, who were pagan and artists as my mother was, made the cover of Look when witchcraft was popular. One produced a book on herbs and herbal health. It never crossed my mind that any of this was unusual. It was just childhood. But the family was also very, very active in civil rights and in Black life, I guess you could say. A woman named Mahalia Jackson was a friend of my grandmother's. So was another woman named Clara Ward. I heard them on occasion singing with my grandmother. I never thought about it. It was just part of childhood. My mother's father had been a follower of a man named Marcus Garvey. And his mother had the last name Loving. A man named Richard Loving was my grandfather's second cousin. If you are familiar with the court case Loving versus the state of Virginia, that was my grandfather's cousin. So active cases involving the Black community, African/Negro/colored, those were all words that were common when I was growing up, were things I heard all the time. Who was going to drive down and feed the young protesters in Camden? Who was going to be chosen to go on a march with fill in the blank? It was all just a normal part of my life. Now, because my family had one of the few televisions in the neighborhood, mostly because my mom worked for RCA, when news hit, most of the neighborhood was gathering in my living room to watch it. For those of you who remember the late 50s and the beginnings of the freedom marches and the turbulent 60s, that was an era that I grew up in. And that was an era where I had family that was also marching. But I was a child. I didn't really understand the danger until a Sunday. One of my aunts, a woman named Marion, was in Alabama, I think, on a bridge. And all of a sudden, all the neighbors came rushing in, and they were gathered around the television, crying and hysterical. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, and they tried to shoo me out. And as usual, I hid under the piano so they couldn't see me. And there had been some sort of shooting, and dogs turned on protesters, and Black people who were killed. It was my first close to home exposure to that which could be very, very ugly and directed toward colored people. Marion proved to be that she survived that one, although she lost part of her leg in Ingram Park. It was taken out by a police attack dog who took out most of her calf, I'm sorry. And the family worried until she and the other freedom riders got back home. A year or so after that, the church decided that they were going to participate in the march, 1968, actually. And as a group, they were going to join other Black voices in Washington, D.C. And they said the kids couldn't go. And about 4 days before the buses came, they relented and had a bus just for us youngins. And we went to DC. They wouldn't let us more than 100 yards away from the bus. So we couldn't see a lot, but we could hear it. And the reason they wouldn't let us stray was because as we got off the bus, wow, we're in Washington, and isn't this wonderful? And we're going to see things. They pointed out the buildings around the quadrangle. And they made us look up at the little figures that were on tops of the buildings that surrounded it. And they reminded us that they had guns pointed at us. And we had to stay close to the bus. We did. We could hear and we could feel the electricity. We just weren't allowed close enough to really see a lot. But the importance of the words that I heard that day sunk in. And listening to a man talking about a dream for his children, about justice, and the belief that one day this nation would rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, hit home. Got back very, very moved. And a good friend said that if I believed what I had heard, a group was forming that was going to sing about things like that. And I went to a meeting and I listened to some music, and music has been a part of my family for many generations. As a matter of fact, I was the only soprano in my family that has been born in 5 generations. All of the women in my family are altos. So music was a part of it. And I listened to the music. But more importantly, I actually listened to the lyrics, because words mean a lot to me, as they did to my mother, who is a great lover of poetry. And I listened to someone saying, God is black, brown, he's yellow, he's red, he's white. Everyone's the same in the good Lord's sight. And I listened to words that said, I believe in people, all people, there's a divine spark. And it's still burning, though the world's getting mighty dark. It's a spark of grace, and it's a spark that makes people great. And there were a lot of other lyrics to the music that I was hearing. And it reminded me of what I had heard in DC. And I said, where do I sign up? The group that I traveled with for my last 3 years in high school was called Up With People. While it is considered cliched now, it was pretty radical when I was singing with them in the 60s. And I chose to because I believed in and still believe the words that I sang. Made me pretty much an idealist, kind of an optimist, but also someone who believed in social justice. I read more, went running off to the library to read more, and the library was home to most of the kids that I went to both elementary school with and high school with. It was the place where we hung out. It was the place where we were free to be who we were. Our librarian was very liberal. She let us play our transistor radios as long as we didn't play loudly. And we talked about the things we had heard from our parents. When newspapers were still popular, the library got 10 of them a day, and we got to read, including 2 Black newspapers. And we read about a war going on. And we read about the exploits of Dr. King and the students who were standing by his side, and the freedom riders who were determined to make this nation live out the true meaning of its creed. So fade out. All things were wonderful, and then King was shot. It rocked my high school. It rocked all of us who had so much believed in what we were singing and the social justice the King was fighting for. So as students in high school, we decided we were going to put up a mural in the school dedicated to Dr. King, and the board approved it, and it was going to be placed in the auditorium with 3 others that had been dedicated by other classes in our high school. The mural, it took us a year to raise the money for it, and for good or ill, it appeared on the front page of a magazine. What the board found out was the faces of the committee that raised that money were parts of the faces in the background behind King. The image was him standing on a mountaintop with the colors of faces of children, youth behind him, all colors. And the board rescinded its permission. So all the fighting and all the work we had done, they said was going to be for naught. And a group called the Roselle Citizens Committee convinced the board that what happens if one of us grows up to be a criminal or an outlaw? So the board said we're not going to hang it. And since I was vice president of the King Committee at the time, I went, oh, hell you are. So we stormed board meeting. They threatened to have us thrown in jail, and then they shut it down. The day the mural was supposed to be hung, the assembly had already been decided on, even though the mural wasn't there. They were afraid we would get rowdy, so the Roselle Citizens Committee had the assembly surrounded by police. A couple of us had enough. We got up and walked out. And when we did, 500 kids walked out behind us. Well, the Citizens Committee, sure we were going to get rowdy, decided that the police needed to do something about the uppity students. Now, in a town as small as Roselle was, the police were not only friends, they were people you knew, they were other people's parents. A couple of them were classmates from a few years before. And they came at us, and the head of the committee and myself started to swing, which I think wasn't expected. And things got a tad bit more aggressive. The police retreated and tried to drive through us. So after forming a human barrier around the police car, we flipped it. It was the first time I realized I was fighting back against something that wasn't fair. An emergency board meeting was called, and it was decided that maybe that mural should be hung the next day. And it was. It's still there. Almost everyone has forgotten who those faces are, because a few are now deceased, and all of us are in our 70s. But the I Have a Dream is still on the school wall. Anyway, off I went to college, and I was due to come back. I went to Ryder in Lawrenceville, close enough to come home to do my laundry and far enough away so that I could call it separation. And I was due to come home that on a weekend, and my mom called and said that the Roosevelt Citizens Committee had burned 3 books on the steps of my library. Mom didn't joke about that, and my mother's library is something I always wanted to emulate, but I think you kind of see how some of that step happened. So before I had borrowed a girlfriend's car, and before I drove home, I drove by the library and got out. And the char marks from the 3 books were still in the stone. And they happened to be right in the place where I used to sit. I realized that library would never be safe for me again, because someone had dared to try to hide, remove, destroy something they didn't agree with. By the way, the 3 books they burned were Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, and Lady Chatterley's Lover. Not that it mattered what the books were. Somebody tried to destroy them. And growing up a child who started reading at 3 and read through my mother's library at a voracious speed, books were sacred in my house. And they were sacred not just because it was a family tradition, but because within Black culture, remembering that my grandparents were 1 generation from slavery, and my grandfather's older brother was born still in slavery. The one thing that was forbidden was knowledge. So you were forbidden to read. You were forbidden to learn. And if you accidentally did, whatever it was you learned would be destroyed, and whoever taught you would be destroyed as well. Fade out. I'm listening to all of this while I'm still singing about freedom and history and learning about the family's history and what it was like on one side, the Davis side, my grandmother, to be free issue or born free. While I was listening to my grandfather's stories and listening to the things that his older brothers had left him in writing, bad writing, about what they remembered of their mother was a slave. It's an interesting place to be when you're a child, surrounded by, included in, believing in, and taking all of it in. In college, that desire led me to led me to majoring in history. Well, I came out with 3 actually, 1 in English, 1 in history, and 1 in education, because I couldn't make up my mind. But the historian started to grow, inspired by the words of a history teacher I had in high school, who said that history wasn't names and dates. It was 1,000 lives intersecting, or groups of people getting together to do something that they believed in, not realizing that it would change a world. Okay. Maybe I would be lucky enough to witness some of that history. I watched my biological family go on to do some pretty awesome things, especially cousins. But I also watched my older cousins fight for this country in Vietnam and then turn around and fight for this country in Selma, Alabama. And write letters from home to home, and my mom writing letters to them about why what they were doing was so important, not just for the country that didn't always accept them, but for the generations who were going to come after them. The first time I got to see a book of history was my mother's, because she wrote to two of my cousins in Vietnam twice a week. She kept a copy of every letter she wrote both of them, and a copy of the letters they wrote back, and compiled them into books that were given to them as gifts. In flipping back through her copy, and the fact that it was its own kind of living history, I realized how important the words that I was singing, the words that I was saying, the history that I was watching, the books that were being taken away, all were. So Phaedra, go off to grad school. Met my partner, and by the way, we are at 49 years, 5 months to our 50th. And boy, was she a young hellion. She was also a writer who made me look at poetry very differently, and look at it not as the words of the past, but as the active words of the present. Became a fan of a woman named Nikki Giovanni, whose words I can still hear, and is still alive, by the way. Became a fan of the words of a professor at UC Berkeley, I think, by the name of Angela Davis, and listened to them as they quoted even older philosophers who talked about the value of history and of the written word, and saving it at all cost. Because someone who could destroy your history will ultimately destroy not your past, but your future. Sounded kind of lofty, wasn't sure I completely understood it. But when my Aunt Marion asked me to take a little voyage with her, a road trip, and I love to drive, down to see a few of the sites where she had protested, things got real fast, along with confusion about how can man really do this to their fellow man, because the idealist in me had run head on into the realism of the world, and the two just didn't jive to me. A few years later, I got to take a drive down to Montgomery and walk in a place called Ingram Park, which was where my Aunt Marion had lost her leg. Met a man who talked about the things that had happened in that park, and showed some of the statues there. And Ingram Park is one of those things you have to experience to fully understand. It is one square block in Montgomery, and it's the park where a lot of protests and marches happened. It's also right across the street from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where those who disagreed decided to plant a bomb on a Sunday and kill 4 little girls and injure an awful lot of other people. And I listened to him talking about the different statues, some of which you have to see to understand. Some of them you walk through, some of them you stand behind, and most of them you just experience. And in one of the statues, one that is probably the most famous, it is life-size of a little boy who is being held off the ground by his collar while he's being eaten alive by a police dog. And his descriptions of that statue were so very vivid that I asked him how he knew so much. And he lifted his shirt. over 200 bite marks. The scars are still there. And he asked me if I wanted to go across the street to the church. And foolishly, I said yes. We walked around it. The area where the bomb was planted still has the char marks. The church refused to wash them off, although they've repaired most of the wall. And he said, come on in. And I said, the Sunday school is active there. He said, yeah, people are in and out all the time because there's a little museum in the entrance. So we went in. And I'm looking around at some of the things that are there, and I can hear the Sunday school class off in the distance. And about 3 cases in, there are, mementos of the church and the bombing itself. But in one case, there's a bloody dress. And I looked down, turned on my heels, and took off. I was about 50 miles away before I calmed down and realized how angry I was. That in that moment, I could have killed someone and never regretted it. Because someone had dared to hurt a child. Someone had dared to hurt an extended family member. An innocent child, 4 were killed. 2 dresses were so badly burned they couldn't do anything with them. And I understood what rage was. It's an emotion I had never experienced before. Came back, calmed down, did the presentations I was supposed to do, and went on to my next event. And a young man, and I was at Southeast Leather Fest, actually. A young man, all gangly thing, said, Miss Johnson, may I speak to you? Now, it's the first time anybody had ever called me Miss Johnson because that's what they called my mother. And I said, sure. And we sat down. And he told me that he had a little gaming store in, I want to say Dearborn, Michigan. And there had been a book burning in front of his store the last weekend. And he was scared for his clients, and he wanted to know if I thought, as his elder, another interesting place to be at the time, he should shut down. He just needed to talk to somebody. I convinced him not to. Because bullies don't do well if you turn around and punch the bully in the nose. And what they were trying to do was scare him. And in doing so, take away a safe haven for the kids who were there for role-playing and some gaming and board games and things like that. And if he shut down, where would they go? So he went on his merry way. And I went upstairs to my hotel room and had a screaming match with God. I am sure there's probably still a hole in the ozone over Decatur where I blew my stack. I'm very surprised in the hindsight of 2020 that I didn't get thrown out of the hotel, because I'm sure they heard me over half of it. I pretty much swore that day that if I could steal it, or beg it, or buy it, or borrow it, you didn't get to hurt my kids again. And right about there was the place where I rectified my idealism and balanced it against the occasional ugliness of reality. Did more reading on great philosophers. One that I quote quite often, and you probably heard me quote, is Heinrich Heine, a German philosopher at least 100 years before Hitler, who says that if you can take away the past from a group, 2 generations later, they will never know you existed. I looked at the work of George Orwell, who said that, please don't let me screw this up, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past.
That's it.
And I looked at all that, and I could hear my mother's words going, I protected you, child. You have others to protect. And I took that pretty seriously. Now, couple that with the fact that for the 10 years before that, as I had entered this tribe as a kinkling, I had been at the right place at the right time to witness some of the most amazing events in this tribe's history and to know the people who made history. Did I? No. Was I at Guy Baldwin's feet when he and Race Bannon helped to write the statement of purpose for the NLA? Yeah. Was I active with NLA when they held their original livings in Leather? Yeah. Was I active with the lesbian sex mafia when they helped to back the Barnard Conference and listen to Gail Rubin stand up and fight against women against porn? Yeah. Was I privileged to watch Annie Sprinkle when she took a stand against the same group? Yeah. And that list could go on and on. Now, the word disciple, as some of you have heard me say, doesn't have the religious connotation most people associate with it. It simply means to bear witness, to have seen with your own eyes. But there's an obligation that goes with being a disciple to history. And let me rephrase that, with being a disciple to events that eventually become history. And that is to tell what you have seen. So that, like any elder, like the ones that I sat at the feet of in my own family home, and listening to stories being repeated, so that it doesn't get lost to the next generation. That the book is as important as the spoken word, but more important than the book is the living memory. And I had been privileged to be living memory to things that now are historic. Were they at the time? No. They were just as my first grade history teacher, a man named Harry Bugalub, had said, there are an awful lot of people whose lives intersect at one point to do something they believe to be right. I often think back to Mr. Erickson hiding in the corner there and listening to him talk about our founding fathers. Well, the bottom line is all they were was a bunch of guys sitting in a tavern having a pint, bitching about their taxes and their wives. Did they know that they were going to found a country? No. Were those who saw it willing to tell what they had seen? Yeah. Did it change their hearts and their minds as they saw the idealism that says we hold these truths to be self-evident while fighting a bloody war? Yeah. Were they willing to fight to tell that story so it didn't get lost? Yeah. Now, I use this word with honor, Ms. J. Every community Every great tribe has stories to tell. Stories that those who would see them quashed want silenced. The road that was created when the idealist met the realist is why I'm here now, and why I am so damnably determined that through the crazy that is to come, through the burning that has already happened, through the persecution that is coming, any historian knows, because they've watched the steps, not just in the past few years, but in the past 30, knows that the history of who you are is what will allow you to, as my grandmother once told me, let the bully hurt your body but not harm your soul, and give you a reason to stand up again and punch the bully dead in the face. That happens because you have a reason to. You stand up again rather than run like a scared rabbit, because you know someone stood up before you. If you don't know, that bully is going to scare you into hiding. I was given the charge, so to speak, listening to those stories at my great-grandmother's feet. I was given the charge when I sat for the first time on the steps of the 2 churches my family founded. I was given the charge the first time I turned down the old Davistown Road and realized that as a colored woman, I actually did have a past. I realized when I picked up a book given to me by a man named Jack Jackson, Eulenspiegel's first and only historian, that was the work of von Sacher-Masoch. That what I did, we didn't invent. That there were an awful lot of people who not only had walked this path before me, but had held me up when I didn't even know I was being held. That had given me a clearer view because I was sitting on their shoulders and I didn't even know it. That was the strength of those who had come before me. And I knew because I had been told. I knew because I had heard the story. Not always pretty, life isn't. But I knew because the history was there and a part of me, kind of like a ramrod up my spine. They kept me straight and looking forward instead of walking with my head down. And I knew when I had that screaming match with God in Decatur, Washington, that you don't get to fuck with my kids' history, because you don't get to fuck with my kids. Are there other little bits and pieces that go with that? Yeah. I meditate. Those of you who have been in my home know it. I am part of a healing circle because of the work of a man named Bob Monroe, who founded the meditation technique in the group that I meditate with. Do I believe in the power of positive energy? Yeah. It's kind of what keeps me going. Do I believe in putting my hands in the soil? Yeah, it's what's kept an awful lot of people alive. It's easier to plant someone, or plant something than someone. But all of those odds and ends and little pieces that I didn't realize were so important. The music, the songs of freedom, the gospel, the spirituals, the 4, and every once in a while 5 generations. It happened very rarely, but it did happen. That would be under one roof. The picking up the child of a young leatherman who was only 3 months old and wrapping him in his daddy's onyx vest and going, "You're going to have a future, because by God, I'm not going to let it be destroyed." All went into making me. All went into making me an optimist and a hellion, a pacifist, someone who listens to the voice of my ancestors, and someone who is still willing to scream at them when I go, "I'm not doing this shit," and they go, "Yeah, you are." They go into recognizing the value of a group and the value of an individual. That went into the constant reminder of, child, this isn't about you. It's about the hand you put out to help someone else. You are not going to be here forever. It's not about you. It's about what you leave behind, so that others will be stronger because you were there. Now, I need you to imagine an 85-year-old woman pounding that into the head of a 10-year-old. But 61, give or take, years later, it all kind of makes sense. Let me see now. On the more light side, when my voice worked very well, I was a soprano and I used to use my voice semi-professionally. In the days of salons, my mom and I did poetry readings all over New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And I've been privileged in ways that, while there were a whole lot of bumps and moguls, still kind of sound like a fairy tale. And hopefully, I'm using it in the right direction. I still want to grow up to be half the woman my mother was. And that's pretty much what made me me.
There's a few little stories that are popping into my head as you've been going through all of these. I'm not sure if you have omitted for brevity, clarity, or some other reason.
Mostly brevity. Remember, I can be horribly long-winded.
Well, you just went for 55 minutes, exactly the way I knew you'd be fine. I didn't need to say a word, and people didn't need to strangle me because I interrupted you. But I can think of several. I'm not sure if you want to tell them, so I'm going to allude to it. And
My
you can
life
tell
is an open book, Matt.
You have one of your school friends' father's piece of accoutrement, do you not?
I did, yes.
I think that story is pertinent to this, if you feel like telling it.
When God was young and dinosaurs roamed the earth, one of my best friends in high school, and the mischief that we got into, all of you are still too young to know about. But we were back and forth to each other's houses all the time. The usual sleepovers to go with teenage girls. And we didn't think about it. We were just good friends. And while her parents were kind of a little gruff around the edges about how long we stayed up when we were having slumber parties, they didn't say anything. Now, When we graduated from high school, Ellen's father gave me a graduation gift. Um, he gave me his Ku Klux Klan uniform. He was a Klansman. I think Ellen knew, I'm not sure. I didn't. And he said that being around me and back and forth being around my family changed his mind. My graduation present from Mr. Nafke was his Klan uniform. Now, ultimately, my family and I had a fight over it, and it ended up in the hands of my family lawyer because my uncle was scandalized that such a thing would ever be in the family home. Um, it is one of the greatest gifts that I've ever been given. Another that I cherish was a half-smoked pack of cigarettes. That was a gift from one of the people that I worked for. He asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I told him I wanted him to stop smoking. So in a little blue Tiffany box for Christmas was the second half of the last pack of cigarettes he ever smoked. Remember what I said about sentimental and idealistic? What can I tell
Um, there were some tales from the mountains in North Georgia back around the mid 2000s, without naming names or involving other folks.
What,
What
getting
what were
into
you
mischief in Jasper, Georgia?
what were you doing in Jasper, Georgia around, oh, I don't know, oh 05, oh 06?
Hanging out,
Yeah.
just getting into trouble.
Yeah, you weren't giving them folks down there ideas about going back to some of the old ways.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Just because I happen to serve someone who was melanin decline, and in an all-white town that had a real bad Southern history, half of them thought that slavery had come back again. And where did they get one? You mean little things like that?
Little things like that in that little town that's not too far from Tara.
I thought it was hysterical, but that's just me.
So did I. That's why I thought you might want to tell one or two.
First time we ever did a scene together, the radio was playing, and of course, what comes on in the middle of that scene but a woman singing a song that begins with "Southern trees bear strange fruit." Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the rest of that song and the fact that it made one black jazz singer very, very famous. The song is called Strange Fruit. Now, I don't know if it was fate having a very bad sense of humor, but the song was actually about lynching. It was written by a man, I believe, named Mirapole, and it was a poem originally that was set to music. And the poem not only made Billie Holiday famous, it kept her out of an awful lot of jazz clubs because the powers that be didn't want to hear her singing it. So there is a lyric in that song that says, "Black bodies swaying in the southern breeze. I happen to have been in Atlanta, Georgia, with my hands cuffed over my head when that song came on the radio." Fate has a sense of humor.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of the stories of jaunting in and out of businesses and, oh, I don't know, the courthouse with things like my mistress needs and
X. But
yeah.
there's also, occasionally it would be Miss So and so. I'm here on business for Miss So and so, and I'd like to examine your courthouse records. First, it was a shock that I could actually put more than four words together in a sentence. Second, it was that I knew what I was looking for. And third, it was the fact that they knew who Miss So and so was. And what the hell was I doing there? Something about tweaking the straights.
Mama was running around basically Tara from Gone with the Wind, saying, my mistress needs, and I am here to procure for my mistress this, and blah, blah, blah. and was firmly convinced that she had convinced the town that certain...
The South had risen
There
again.
you go. I believe your exact words were, you felt that if she would just beat you in the town square, they would have made
They
her
would have
mayor.
elected her mayor. There are times when it's just fun.
All right, folks. I am hoping. Are you all done? Are you?
Unless somebody's got a
Oh,
question.
I'm sure there's questions. Um, what I am wondering. Let's go ahead and get some hands for those. If you guys have questions, I got lots of private messages. Folks are very glad this is being recorded. Very powerful, etc., etc. Peg wants to know if you did you ever imagine you would be a historian and have the library? Did it just happen, or was it something you aspired to be and have?
Heck, it just happened. Let me rephrase that. It happened. It happened so slowly, and it happened in stages. Did I realize what was going on? No, I really didn't. Some of this story I have told in other videos. It was just basically saving, for my own personal history, some of the things that were important to me. Stage one, go running off to Oklahoma, where those things that Jill and I had staved, our next gens made us realize they weren't just our old stuff. They were actually their history. Had never thought about it there. And then they wanted more. So whenever I went to an event, because that's the advantage or disadvantage of bicoastal relationships, if I went to an event, don't put your program down because I was probably going to snatch it. Because either my club brothers wanted souvenirs or my kinklings wanted souvenirs. They wanted to know more. And the more they wanted to know, the more I went out and found for them. I wasn't thinking about the boxes in the closet that were kind of growing. I didn't consider it anything except finding the information my next gens wanted. They want, Mom, you know, so-and-so, can you get their book? Or, Mom, you're going to this event, can you bring back programs? Or my club brothers would go, we're never going to get the chance to. Can you bring us back a t-shirt? And it just kept growing. And then, like I said, I ran into a young man who had a book burning. And all of the past and everything my mom had ever said about the value of a book, good or bad, because that which is good builds our confidence, and that which is bad teaches us what not to do. So you don't destroy the evidence because the evidence has a lesson. And it built, and it built, and it built. I was asked to do a show and tell. So I did. Grabbed some of the things that were in the many boxes in the ever-growing collection and told stories about them while I was passing them around. An old-fashioned, at least when I was in elementary school, show and tell. And by the time Peg I had done it 5 or 6 times, I realized nobody was hearing most of what I was saying, which was actually a good thing. They were nose down in whatever it was that I was passing around. And then wonderful man said, I've been in this class 5 different times. I have never seen the same thing twice. How much of this do you own? And I had to think about that,
That,
because I honestly couldn't answer the question.
that wasn't a question you were ready to face, were you?
It was a question I had never gotten. And he said, well, can you pack up all of it and bring it to this event that my wife and I are going to be starting? And I went, sure, you know, probably 8 or 9 boxes, and I can throw it in the back of my car. I was wrong. But by the time I pulled the boxes out from behind the sofa, dismantled the dining room sidebar because they were all made out of boxes, pulled the boxes out of my closet, pulled the boxes out of Jill's closet. She actually didn't know they were there. Um, Long story. And looked at all of the boxes. There were a lot more of them than I thought there were. So I went and I rented a van and I threw them all in the back of the van and went, God, there's a lot of this. Drove down to the Carolinas, took all the boxes out, had a couple of members of the family there as we unpacked all the boxes and put them on the tables in this room. And I went, holy.
Are we talking together in leather in '05?
Yeah,
I
3.
was
03 was.
'03. Okay. Okay.
And I kind of looked down, Peg, and I went, holy, there's a lot of this. And then people kept coming in and coming in and coming in again and again and again. And a couple of the visiting club members said, can you bring some of this to our event? And I went, sure. Will you get me some coffee? You know, everybody's got a price. Coffee was mine. And then we went to and loaded it into the van, and I went to some events and I went to some club meetings with smaller packages of it. And while I'm doing all of this and going to other events and taking their programs and adding those, and whatever book might be at the bookseller and the vendors fair and adding those, and the boxes kept growing until, and I think, Peg, you know this part of the story. One day Jill came home, fell over a box, said, how much of this is there? And get this, to a storage unit. And the next thing I knew, there was a library. Did I set out to do it? No. Like so many things in my life, it just happened.
Yeah, that's not even mentioning eBay.
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm pushing my nose back in on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, it about knocked the camera off top of your monitor there. Folks, I know you got questions. Raise your hands. There's got to be some. Thank you, Sir Welf. That was what I intended to say when Mama finished speaking was, and the congregation said, Amen.
I told you I could be a little long-winded.
It was fantastic, and you're right. I've heard pieces, parts of it, but not all woven together into the full story.
Is Kodiak around?
Yeah.
There's my Kodiak. Where are you, young man? I might as well start this story now. The masochist named Kodiak has decided that he and his family are coming on as the youngest annex in the Carter Johnson family. So there's going to be a Carter Johnson in LA. Poor guy. I don't think he actually knew what he was getting into. When
he did. I gave him plenty of warnings about heavenly bodies and gravity wells, and once you were in them, you weren't getting. I warned him from the first moment he said he thought he might like to. So don't. He knew.
What started this with Courtney is, Kodiak, the same thing I'm going to say to you. It is more work than you can imagine. It is time consuming. It is something that will eat your lunch. It is also a sacred charge. The new logo for LA. This is Kodiak's new logo. You are now a keeper of history. It is a privilege. It is a paying it forward. It is its own charge, and it is its own armor. You are protecting the stories of this generation for the next one. And you are encouraging the next generation to have their own. It sneaks up on you. It's kind of like being a genealogist. You don't know what happened until you're in the middle.
Hearing you tell the whole story, I feel more weight around all the genealogy that you do.
And it is a mantle. You have chosen to put it on. Some would say pick it up. Like Scott or Matt or Joey or all of the members who have taken on Carter Johnson's, and we're still growing. Each of you is your own nest, because a wise man does not put all his eggs in one basket. And as the insanity comes, and you find yourself gathering more and more so that it can't be destroyed, you'll have even more of an idea of what it means to be a Carter Johnson. So in front of everyone who is here now, I'm saying thank you.
Wolf?
We had
I'm stepping in. I'm sorry. I'm stepping in for my daddy, Master Kodiak, just to kind of say thank you. Unfortunately, he's not able to be on camera at the moment. He's, as you all are, a very busy man, and so we just want to say thank you for accepting us to be part of this lifelong journey, and we wholeheartedly understand the volume that it's going to be and the intensity that it's going to be, and just are so happy to be here.
Good to see you, Blue.
I think Scott wanted me to tell a story about my first run-in with a book burner outside of the Roselle Citizens Committee. What had happened was,
Get back to you, Wolf.
in the very early days of eBay, and when I was still doing the show and tell, I wanted to show the next group that I was going to do the show and tell for what it meant to have a numbered tome, a numbered book. Many of the books in the rare book room at the Carter Johnson are there because of their age, or they're there because they're numbered. Now, today, a numbered tome is very valuable. Back in the day, the number in a book protected the publisher. For instance, you're a man of letters, and you have your own little library that has science and astrology and erotica, and it's probably all bound in the colors of your library, and your son's best friend goes creeping into the library and finds your copy of Venus and Furs or Psychopathia Sexualis and sneaks it out of your library and goes running home with the book. And he's reading it in bed, and mom catches him and looks at it and goes, see? And writes a letter to the publisher threatening to sue them for corrupting the morals of a minor. And the publisher says, can you tell me more about the book that theoretically I've corrupted your son with? And the publisher, the woman will say, or man will say, or whichever parent catches them, I got them with a copy of Venus and Furs, and it's number 123. And the publisher then turns around and goes, I'm very sorry, but number 123 was sold too. If your son got the book, you're going to have to talk too. So the number protected the publisher. Now, when you look at a book that is number 178 out of 1500, or 625 out of 1,000, there will only ever be one. Not like today where there are probably 5,000 copies of Doing It for Daddy or 10 to 15,000 copies of Coming to Power. The books that told our story were printed for private collectors in very small print runs. So all of that backs up to say, I wanted to show my next show and tell what it meant to look at a numbered book. So, early days of eBay. I had the advantage of living at that point with Jill in a little town called Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia. And a company called Comcast, decided to pick 5 towns to test the high-speed wire on. They wanted to make sure everything worked and all of the stuff was in place and there weren't going to be any glitches. Willow Grove was one of the towns that was chosen to test the high-speed internet. So I had a button that was very, very fast. Unlike most people who were still at the tail end of dial-up. Don't laugh, I still remember it.
Still remember it. You've still got the email address.
So in a very young eBay, back in the days where buyers and sellers could talk to each other, eBay made no attempt to hide our identities. A book came up for sale. Specifically, it was by one publishing company that printed a lot of our things in the 30s called Falstaff Press. And it was a copy of The History of Sex Lives in England. Now, remembering that what we do is called the British Vice. So it talked about all of the, the ways the English were just as twisted as an old coat hanger and so on and so forth. And it had a number, and I wanted it. So the book is now up for bid. I knew, and someone had already bid on it. I knew if I got into a bidding war, this thing would go way out of my price range because, I was the one buying these books. So I set up my computer and I put the bid in and I watched the countdown. And at about 5 or 4 seconds, I hit the button, knowing that if I was the high bidder, the person I was bidding against would not have time to come back against me. So I won the bid and I'm doing the happy dance. I finally have a limited edition tome that I can show to the tribe and show them how important this is. So if you're ever in a used bookstore and you see something like it, go buy it. So this is wonderful. Got it. Now, remembering we could all talk to each other. No restrictions, no nothing. So I found out who I was bidding against and we started talking. Now here I am thinking, I have someone else who is buying rare books like I was. And maybe he could help me find other books that were within my price range. On the other hand, the man that I was talking to thought that I was what he was. Part of a group of Christian cells, he used the word, I did not, who were being paid by the right to find these books, to burn them. That was the first time I had to have a little conversation with God about, if you're going to help me do this, you are going to have to help me do this because those people are fucking nuts and they don't get to go after our tribe's history. So all the ancestors, I know you're listening, leather and otherwise, you're going to have to direct me to this so that I can get this before these motherfuckers do. And I know Shah is going to have to censor me, but stuff happens. So it was an interesting encounter. Now eBay has changed and you can no longer talk to people, but a lot of our history is still coming up on sites like eBay and Etsy, because grandchildren now are finding their grandparents' libraries, not knowing what to do with them. They're either selling them themselves or they're turning entire libraries over to auction houses who come into the house and auction everything. Sometimes, if we're lucky, there's folks like us who are buying them to go, that is an amazing book and I want it on my library shelf. And sometimes you're going to run into someone who says, it's time to burn it. So.
There's a little snippet of the rare book room.
Now, part of the reason for hunting that first edition is because, as anyone who has ever written a book knows, you have your first edition and then you tweak it, or you have your proof and then you tweak it and you start to change things. And if you have changed it enough through rewrites, you can't even remember what your first thought was. So having that first edition of so many of these allows us to go back and look at the things that were changed, added, corrected, rearranged. And having the first edition of something also lets you know if something was changed, what it was changed from. So not only do you not get to burn it, you especially don't get to burn first editions. That's my inside voice.
Or buy first editions and cut all the art out and then sell it again as a first edition. Wolf.
I was just going to relate. Giggles had a question for you. She asked, Mama Vi, as an advocate, how do you stay within the lines of right and wrong, fighting for what is right? How do you stop yourself from lowering your morals to fight for what is right?
Ouch. That's not always easy. Most of you see the mother, now grandmother, the crone. The crone has her demons, and they're pretty powerful. Once I found out that I could go into a rage, I had to be careful. There are certain things that cross my boundaries, and I will attack first and think third. Walking that line, let me rephrase that. Walking in that gray area, because it isn't a line, it's a very small area, where the fight is real, but I'm not going any farther unless you come into that gray area and challenge me. It's not as easy as most people would tell you it is. Classic example. There are a lot of issues that come and go on Facebook that, because most cannot separate my personal voice from the library, not only do I stay out of, I choose not to find out about, so that I cannot have an opinion. But if you push me, you may find out that there is a ring-tailed bitch that is coming back at you with a baseball bat. It's not easy. Especially when those I love are involved. This family of kink took us in when we were kinklings and didn't know anything, and sheltered us and protected us. And the men, there were 3 of them, 2 gay, 1 straight, that I owe and will spend the rest of my life paying that debt for, charged us to do the right thing as we saw it. Now, there are times when the easiest way to do the right thing is to get rid of the guy who is the enemy, rather than trying to be reasonable and balance reason and the beast. Every once in a while, the beast wins. Like I said, I have flipped a cop car. I know what happens when adrenaline runs. Can I still do it? No, for God's sakes, I'm over 70. Now I know the chemicals it requires to hide a body, because I can't dig the hole anymore.
Giggles, was that your question?
That was actually one of them, because I've been doing advocacy for a very long time, and I always have an issue with trying to stay within the lines and not step over boundaries. But I was going to ask about if the Johnson Carter in Mississippi, when I was doing trans advocacy rights, we had
Motorcycle
a
just went by behind us.
we each independently did a biography for each of us, like trans advocates, and we put it onto a server so that our stories could be saved for future generations. And I was going to ask if the Carter Johnson Library was thinking about doing that with like older, like leather community, or so that we could get firsthand experience of the knowledge, like kind of like if an interview. You get where I'm going with it, and that's why I wanted to ask if Carter Johnson Library was thinking about doing any kind of documentaries
We're beginning.
on.
We're beginning. Partially because so many of the elders who walk this path are now dying. Partially because our young ones are coming in with brand new ideas and new ways. Both of them have to be balanced and preserved. Our youngest griot, Ms. J, has stories to tell that weave her indigenous traditions together with our leather customs in ways that most would never think. Those stories must be preserved. The stories of the struggles of all people, because I look at my trans brothers and sisters as simply my brothers and sisters. And I want to know those struggles, just like I learned the struggles of my biological family, so that when your next generations come, they know others have walked before them. So we're beginning to preserve those stories. Some of them were done with Sarah Humble and the project that was Women in Leather Legacy. So a number of people have begun to preserve them. The most important thing for me is that they be preserved and accessible. I know Race Bannon has preserved I think he calls it the Cigar Social or something to that effect. He and a number of men meet once or twice a month and they just tell stories. There are a number of other people who are also doing interviews. Ideally, I would love to see not necessarily all of them in the same place, but all of them linked so that anyone who's looking can find them. This is the stepping stone. It is the next brick in the path. The stories of the activities that you're doing now are the stories that will give the next generation the strength to stand up straight. Anything, I'm going to tell you what Matt told me 4 years ago, when I laughed in his face and said, I can't do this. Hit the button on Zoom. Sit in front of the camera every time a story crosses your mind. This is why the wonder of this great electronic device is so important. Can I figure out half of it? No. Do I know it records? Yes. When the story crosses your mind, record it. Put it on an MPQRST, whatever the hell it is, that records and makes sound waves, or however y'all do this thing, and send it to us. Slowly but surely, as the library's YouTube page grows, I am hoping we will have a lot of other channels within the master system so that we can set up Leather Elder Stories, that we can set up Miss J's stories, so that we can set up presenters who want the videos of their stories preserved, so that we can have other channels within the YouTube channel, so that all of it's accessible. Every time you think of a story, every time you're talking to someone and they start a story, pick up this great electronic thing that does everything but make phone calls and record it so that it's preserved. Then put a copy on your own computer and send a copy to us.
Those of you that are hanging out with us on the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month know that that's exactly what we're doing. Leather Chronicles is recording and archiving and putting out there for general consumption the knowledge of folks who were around and created leather history. And then the third Wednesday of the month, we're talking about leather. So that's you can come grumble, preach, reminisce. 3 Wednesdays out of the month, we're talking leather, some way, some form, fashion. Wolf, got Peg's questions?
Peg's questions.
I've got those queued up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Her first question was wanting to know if she could bring her book, well, your book, her copy of your book to the presentation with Mr. Smear to get it signed at MSC.
I can answer that one. That one's probably a yes.
Sure thing.
Yeah. And she also wants to know, what is your most prized and precious possession in the library and how was it acquired?
Just one?
Be right back.
I was going to say, I think Peg broke her.
No, but I knew the answer would be nearby.
The most prized possession for me in this library is something 99.7% of the people who visit, in this case, my workroom, which is an extension of the library, although nowhere near as neat, never even notice. For me, it's
You got it. Oh, you got it.
this piece of paper is a man's freedom papers. This very well folded and loved and worn thing is the difference between freedom and slavery. These are manumission documents that said that the man who carried them was free and black. It sits very quietly. It was a gift, actually, more years ago than I can even remember.
It wasn't
From
that
Matt.
long ago.
He found them in
Antique store
an antique store,
Ringgold, Georgia.
and he bought them for me. F. Dent to R. Green. It was the deed for his own body. It is a deed of emancipation. And the funny thing is, when I'm traveling in the South, though it means absolutely nothing, and please remember, I live on the Ohio River. From my favorite restaurant with a really good wrist rocket, I could hit a slave state. When I cross, I have a tendency to wear this. Part of it is joke, part of it is remembrance. This is a North Carolina slave freedom tag. It's the person who is wearing it is free. It stays usually in the bag that's attached to my my storyteller staff, along with a cut nail from my great-grandmother's slave quarters. But the most precious thing in the library is right here.
That was in a display case in an antique store in Ringgold, Georgia. And it was the most powerful piece of paper I have ever held in my hands. And the energy that came off of that, I knew you had to have. I had to bring that to you. That thing is so folded and worn from being on that man's person always. Always. And I cannot express the power of holding it in your hand. It is a man's freedom that you can hold in your hand. It's incredible. And I had no idea that I gifted you your favorite part of the library. So I'm going to do a little dance. And we can go on.
Okay, that's probably not what you were expecting.
No, I figured you'd come back with a unicorn or.
That second. Most of you who have heard me tell stories know the reference to the unicorn, but once again, don't go anywhere.
That's where I figured you were going. Has she, Scott, and I forgot? Oh. I'm old.
For those of you who have never seen a unicorn, this is a unicorn. This is book 1 and book 2 of the dissertation of Dr. Gail Rubin. Gail did this in the early 90s.
94, I believe.
And it is what made her the cultural anthropologist that she is. There were 7 copies, I believe. 1 went to the university where she got the dissertation. 2 went to her sponsoring professors. And the 1 went to a friend and the rest were on her shelf. Now, getting a hold of Gail's dissertation can be acquired on microfilm or microfiche from the University of Michigan, which is where she did all of her work. It can be up to a 2-year wait. I have wanted to read it for forever. So about 7 or 8 years ago, when Robbie and I were in San Francisco and we had taken the library there, about the same time I had given a member of my leather family $125 in quarters because they were on the way to the University of Michigan to do some interviews. I said, you are going to sit in the library and you are going to copy Gail's dissertation. And we had the library at the Center for Sex and Culture, and Gail walked in, and we were talking for a while because Gail and I have known each other for about that long. And I told her that, you know, I had a family member heading to the university to copy her dissertation. And when she stopped laughing, she went, "No, wait a minute, you're serious." I went, "Uh-huh. You want it that badly?" "Uh-huh." So she said, "Come on." So we walked the 2 blocks to her house because her house is within the area of the Folsom Street Fair. And I've been in Gail's home many times. I had never walked through the magic door that separated Kansas from Oz. Because you remember in the movie, it's all black and white until she steps out into Oz and it turns to gold. I walked into Gail's library, and if I could think of a way to hit her in the head and then back up an 18-wheeler and take every book she owned, yes, I would do it. So I'm wandering through the stacks because this room is
There's that fabulous Evansville internet. Is that Mama or me?
ginormous, and it's stacked like a regular restaurant. I'm drooling down my computer.
You
And we
froze
get
up.
to a place on
You
the
froze
shelf.
up there, Mama, at ginormous.
Okay. Room is ginormous. And we're wandering the stacks, and I'm, you know, making an absolute fool of myself because I know I'm drooling down my shirt and looking like a 3-year-old in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. So we get to one place on the stacks, and she pulls out the first book and she drops it in my arms, and she pulls out the second book and she drops it in my arms and says, "Here, you want it that badly." And I just stood there like this, the fear that she might change her mind and take it back. And I'm looking stupid. And I went, "Really?" And she said, "You want it that badly." Now, there were 3
Conditions.
other sets on her shelf. This is it. There were 7 copies, I believe, printed. These are the originals. The condition, she gave me 2 conditions. She said it cannot be copied because she swears she's going to update and publish it. She's been telling me that for at least a decade and a half. And she said it can't leave your possession. So if you want to read it, first you visit the library, and then you come and you get lost in my workroom. You can take it anywhere in the house, and that's as far as it goes. So you're stuck being a guest in my guest room. It is actually a brilliant and fairly quick read.
It goes faster than you think it will.
This is the second greatest possession in the library, and what we call the unicorn.
Can you read the title for everybody?
Okay. The Valley of the Kings, Leatherman in San Francisco, 1960 to 1990, volumes 1 and 2.
There is a lot of history in it. There are a couple of words that people swear never existed in it. There is a lot of stories of parties and bars and places, not just in San Francisco. It is a fabulous read if you have any interest in the history of this tribe. Wolf.
Actually, I probably ought to start reading the comments. There's I can't see them.
This one is from Bella. Question: when can we expect to have the audible version of your book narrated by you?
As soon as I am done working for the season and we load up the car and go to Evansville, grab Mama, chain her to the couch in the apartment downstairs with a light and a copy of the book and a video camera.
Well, we want it on Audible.
Uh, before I developed some throat problems, I probably would have said maybe a little easier. But what I have always wanted to hear is other people reading their favorite passages and put together basically a compilation of maybe 100 or 200 of the entries read by different people in this community. Pick your favorite passage and read it.
Okay, bye.
And in response and thankfulness for the people who would be willing to do that, they want to hear you read the book.
Bye.
There are some times when in public I will do 4 or 5 entries, like when for what's coming up with Mir and Me. There are a couple of passages that I'm going to be reading, mostly because, well, they were all written about her. But there are some of them that I don't think she's ever really looked at. I am told, because when you write your own journal, you're not thinking about what you're writing. And for me, as many of you have heard me say, my journal was my Pandora's box in reverse. The emotions went into the box so that I could continue on without them overpowering me. The stories went into the box because at the time they were so overwhelming, I needed to write them down, if only to get them out of my head. I have been told that the ones that are the most erotic are the last 3 years with Mir. I will have to take your word for it, but there are a couple that come to mind just because, as beautiful as she is, she's absolutely oblivious to some of the things that go around her. Men driving into telephone poles because they're staring at her. She just doesn't happen to notice. Bar fights in lesbian bars over her. She just doesn't happen to notice. And so on. So I wrote about them, and I plan on reading a couple of them back to her. As well as the horrible poetry that I had written, or prose actually, that I had written about her, some of which I will probably be reading in a couple of weeks at MSC. But
I'm having Shar.
sucks.
Sorry, I am having Shar. Didn't you just spend the first hour telling us about the only alto in the family and the presentation? I'm sorry, soprano. Yes, the only alto, soprano in the family, and all the
from Jersey, sopranos.
Right. So Shar has just linked to the Mistress Mir episode of Librarian Speaks, where you can hear and watch Mama be embarrassed by all the stories about the book. And now we're going to go to Shar, who's going to get on you again about you recording that audible of your book. Go ahead, Shar.
I'm going to remind you one more time. If you could have Tony DeBlas reading his book to you, is that what you want? And I know the answer, so I'm not even gonna stop there. But I'll make you a deal. I will start a project right now where I will find people. I will have them make recordings of your book. I will recreate the thing that you are asking for.
In exchange.
I'll do it too. How's that?
But in order to finish that project, in order to get that project, you have to promise me that you will start sitting down in front of your Zoom and reading your book so that we can have both. Because I'm not opposed to either of those. Both of those would be awesome to have.
Yep.
But I'm sorry, there's a difference between having somebody else read Tony DeBlas and Tony DeBlas reading Tony DeBlas. And the same is true for you.
We threatened her with the vest, with the tripod, with the camera on it. I'm thinking my newest thought is, when we get the chance, we will come up, kidnap her into her own basement, put one of these lights on her.
Also have to be quiet. That's the other thing about it. Remember when this was a quiet street?
True. Put one of these lights on you,
I need the light. I thought you just
And we'll
wanted
do a
my
video
voice.
of it, and then we can sell a DVD of it for fundraising for the Carter Johnson, and then put it on Audible.
Who here wants to see Vi in bondage, being threatened with not allowed to have coffee until she reads the next passage? Raise your hands.
Susie's willing to come help, I'm pretty sure.
Oh,
Who's going to buy that video? Look at all the hands go up, Miss Vi.
I'm ignoring all of you.
All right,
of-
folks.
And Courtney, I know where you live. That's all
So
I'm saying.
will you, on this recording where you can't take it back, make that bargain with me? I will set up the project. I will make the book reading you want happen. I'll make it
I'd be
happen.
quiet.
I will find you quiet.
For this, I will actually drink tea. Because as I'm getting older and the voice is changing.
You all heard it.
I bet you the basement's pretty quiet. Darcy says Sir wants to log in on a separate machine just so he can raise his hand too. So
Okay, so you all heard it. Help me keep her to it, and watch for a link to send videos to, because apparently y'all are now involved in reading her book to her.
Good luck putting this back in order.
It'll be all right. I'll figure it out.
Rune says I'm pretty sure a bunch of us on here would read passages for the project. I would imagine so as well.
And it's funny, if we're going to do it, one of the things that I was asked was to explain certain passages, and I guess maybe after reading it, I probably should.
We could have a little supplement at the end of each chapter.
Addendum.
Yeah.
Addendum.
Sir Welf says, Mama, you agreed. Leather, accountability. Smiley face. And on that bombshell, we'll go ahead and wrap up the recorded section of Leather Chronicles, Episode 6, The Origins of Vi.